It's often said that truth is stranger than fiction, and tonight, you'll be taken on a journey that exemplifies this adage. Picture this: a small, quiet town where life moves at a slow, steady pace. Nothing out of the ordinary ever happens here, or so it seems. But behind the closed doors of a seemingly ordinary home, a nightmare was quietly unfolding. This is a story of grief, fear, and the unimaginable terror that can lie hidden just beneath the surface of normalcy. In this tale, you'll witness how a family, already reeling from a tragic loss, was pushed to the brink by events that defied logic and reason. And the most terrifying part? It's all true. In the mid-1980s, the Andrews family lived in a modest home in the suburbs of Townsend, Massachusetts. The family was close-knit, the type of family that spent evenings together, talking and enjoying each other's company. But their world was shattered when the matriarch of the family, Mrs. Deborah Andrews, was diagnosed with cancer. It was an aggressive form, and despite the doctor's best efforts, she passed away in 1986. The loss was sudden and devastating, leaving her husband, Brian Andrews, and their two teenage daughters, Annie and Jessica, in a state of profound grief. Brian Andrews was a hard-working man, dedicated to providing for his family. Before his wife's passing, he had been the sole breadwinner, working long hours to ensure a comfortable life for his wife and daughters. But after Deborah's death, those long hours became even more frequent. Brian found solace in his work, perhaps as a way to distract himself from the pain of losing his wife. This, however, meant that Annie and Jessica were often left alone in the house, trying to navigate their grief without the comforting presence of their father. Annie, the elder of the two sisters, was 15 years old at the time. She was known in school for being friendly and outgoing, but the loss of her mother changed her. She became quieter, more withdrawn. Jessica, who was only 14, looked up to her sister, and the two became even closer after their mother's death. They were each other's support system, but the emptiness left by their mother's absence was palpable. The Andrews family had always been close, and the loss of Deborah left a void that was impossible to fill. The girls missed their mother terribly. They missed her comforting words, her warm embrace, and the sense of security she provided. As the weeks turned into months, the pain of their loss did not diminish. Instead, it seemed to grow, settling into the corners of their hearts and minds, like a shadow that refused to lift. One cold, dark evening, when Brian was working late, Annie and Jessica found themselves sitting alone in their living room. The house felt different now, emptier, quieter, almost as if it had taken on a life of its own after their mother's passing. The girls, seeking some form of connection with their lost mother, decided to do something they had only heard about in whispers. They would try to contact her using a Ouija board. Ouija boards have long been associated with the supernatural, and for many, they are a source of curiosity and fear. The idea of communicating with spirits, particularly those of loved ones, can be both comforting and terrifying. For Annie and Jessica, It was a last-ditch effort to reach out to their mother, to feel her presence once more, even if just for a moment. The girls retrieved the Ouija board from a box of old toys in the basement. It was a simple board with the letters of the alphabet etched onto it, along with the numbers 0 through 9, the words yes, no, and goodbye. They set it up on the floor of their living room, placing their hands gently on the planchette, a small, heart-shaped piece of wood that would move across the board to spell out messages. Neither Annie nor Jessica had ever used a Ouija board before. They didn't know the proper rituals or the traditional ways to summon spirits. They were simply two grieving teenagers, desperate to feel close to their mother again. As they sat on the floor, the room lit only by the soft glow of a single lamp, they began to speak. "Mom, are you there?" Annie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The planchette didn't move. The girls waited, their hearts pounding in their chests, but the board remained still. "Mom, if you're here, please give us a sign," Jessica added, her voice trembling. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The girls felt a pang of disappointment. They had hoped, naively perhaps, that their mother would reach out to them from beyond the grave. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that no such connection would be made that night. Still, they continued to ask questions, their voices filled with longing and sadness. "Mom, we miss you so much. Are you okay? Are you watching over us?" But the planchette remained unmoving, and eventually, the girls decided to put the board away. As they did, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though they dismissed it as a product of their imaginations. The Ouija board session had been emotionally draining, and the girls felt a mixture of sadness and relief as they went upstairs to bed. They were disappointed that they hadn't made contact with their mother, but in some ways, they were also relieved. The idea of actually communicating with a spirit, even that of their beloved mother, was terrifying. As they lay in their separate bedrooms, the house was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the soft rustling of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. But then, just as they were beginning to drift off to sleep, they heard it. It was a tapping sound, faint but unmistakable. At first, they thought it was just the house settling, or perhaps a branch brushing against the side of the house. But as the tapping continued, it became clear that it was something else, something deliberate. Jessica, feeling a chill run down her spine, got out of bed and went to her sister's room. "Annie, do you hear that?" she whispered. Annie nodded, her face pale in the dim light. "Yeah, I hear it." The tapping seemed to be coming from inside the walls, moving from one side of the house to the other. The girls listened, their fear growing with each passing moment. But when they tried to pinpoint the source of the sound, it stopped, leaving them in an oppressive silence. The girls, now fully awake and frightened, couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. They had wanted to believe that the tapping was a sign from their mother, a comforting presence watching over them. But deep down, they knew that this was something else, something that didn't belong in their home. When their father came home later that night, the girls told him about the tapping. They were eager to share what they believed was a connection to their mother. But Brian, exhausted and emotionally drained, was skeptical. He listened patiently as they described the sounds, but he couldn't bring himself to believe that it was anything more than their imagination. "I know you girls miss your mother," Brian said gently. "But sometimes, our minds can play tricks on us when we're grieving. It's natural to want to feel close to her, but we have to remember that she's gone." The girls protested, insisting that the tapping was real, that it was their mother trying to communicate with them. But Brian remained unconvinced. He reassured them that he believed they were sincere, but he couldn't accept that there was anything supernatural at play. That night, as the girls lay in their beds, they couldn't stop thinking about the tapping. They wanted to believe their father, but the sound had been so real, so tangible. It was hard to dismiss it as mere imagination. And as they finally drifted off to sleep, they couldn't help but wonder if their mother was truly gone, or if she was still with them in some way. In the days that followed, the tapping sounds continued. Each night, as the girls prepared for bed, the tapping would begin. Sometimes faint and distant, other times loud and insistent. It always seemed to come from different parts of the house, sometimes from the walls, sometimes from the ceiling, and other times from the floor. The sounds began to take a toll on the girls. They were exhausted from the lack of sleep and growing increasingly anxious. The tapping was not just a nuisance. It was beginning to feel like a threat. But every time they called their father into the room to listen, the tapping would stop, leaving them feeling frustrated and helpless. Brian, still skeptical, started to worry that the girls were becoming too fixated on the idea of their mother's spirit. He considered taking them to see a therapist, hoping that professional help might ease their grief and help them move on. But he also didn't want to dismiss their feelings outright, so he decided to wait and see if the situation improved on its own. Meanwhile, the girls were growing more frightened. The tapping was no longer just an annoyance. It was starting to feel malevolent. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something that didn't belong in their home. And as the tapping grew louder and more frequent, their fear deepened. One night, after another long day at school, the girls decided to confront the tapping head-on. They were tired of being afraid, tired of feeling helpless. As they sat together in the living room, the tapping began again, this time louder than ever before. It seemed to be coming from the basement. With a mix of fear and determination, the girls grabbed a flashlight and slowly made their way down the stairs to the basement. The air was cold and damp, and the smell of mildew filled their noses. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the tapping stopped, plunging them into an eerie silence. They scanned the room with the flashlight, their hearts pounding in their chests. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and the faint outline of the Ouija board they had used weeks earlier. But there was no sign of anything unusual, no source for the tapping, no sign of a spirit or presence. Just as they were about to turn and head back upstairs, something caught their eye. Scrawled on the wall in red letters were the words, "Come find me. I'm in your closet." The sight of the writing sent a wave of terror through the girls. This was no longer just tapping. This was a direct message, a taunt. It wasn't their mother. It was something else, something that wanted to hurt them. Without another word, the girls turned and fled the basement, racing up the stairs and out of the house. They didn't stop until they reached their neighbor's home, where they frantically knocked on the door, begging to be let in. Their neighbor, concerned and alarmed by their panic, let them in and tried to calm them down. Between sobs and gasps for breath, the girls explained what had happened: the tapping, the writing on the wall, and their growing fear that something malevolent was in their home. The neighbor, unsure of what to do, decided to call Brian at work. When Brian arrived home, he found his daughters still shaken and terrified. They insisted that they hadn't written the message on the wall, but Brian, still skeptical, couldn't believe that anyone else could have done it. "You girls have to stop this," Brian said firmly. "I know you miss your mother, but this isn't healthy. We need to move on." The girls, desperate to be believed, tried to explain that they hadn't done anything, that the tapping and the writing were real. But Brian, still struggling with his own grief, couldn't bring himself to believe them. He chalked it up to their overactive imaginations and the emotional toll of losing their mother. That night, after returning home with their father, the girls reluctantly went to bed. The house was quiet, but the fear lingered. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that they were not alone. And as they lay in their beds, the tapping resumed, this time faint and distant, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. The next few days passed in a haze of fear and anxiety. The tapping continued, growing louder and more erratic. The girls were exhausted, their sleep interrupted night after night by the relentless noise. Their father, still skeptical, tried to reassure them, but the tension in the house was palpable. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, the girls heard the tapping again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling. It was coming from the basement, just like before. With a mix of dread and determination, they decided to investigate once again. As they entered the basement, the tapping stopped, just as it had before. But this time, they noticed something different. The words on the wall, "Come find me, I'm in your closet," were still there, but they looked fresher, as if they had been recently rewritten. The girls' hearts raced as they scanned the room with the flashlight. There was no one there, no sign of an intruder, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if something was watching them from the shadows. They could feel the weight of unseen eyes on them, and it sent a shiver down their spines. Suddenly, they heard a loud crash from upstairs. The girls screamed and bolted out of the basement, racing up the stairs and into the living room. They found that a lamp had been knocked over, its bulb shattered on the floor, but there was no sign of what or who had caused it. Panic set in, and the girls once again fled to their neighbor's house. This time, their fear was palpable, and even their neighbor began to worry that something was truly wrong. When Brian arrived home, the girls refused to go back into the house. They were convinced that something evil had taken up residence there. Brian, still struggling to understand what was happening, decided that enough was enough. He would search the entire house, top to bottom, to prove to his daughters that there was nothing to fear. Armed with a flashlight, he entered the house, determined to find the source of the disturbances. He began in the living room, carefully inspecting every corner, every piece of furniture. From there, he moved to the kitchen, the bathroom, and the bedrooms, methodically checking every room. But there was nothing, no sign of an intruder, no sign of anything unusual. Finally, Brian made his way to the basement. As he descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and the smell of mildew became more pronounced. He swept the flashlight across the room, his eyes scanning every inch of the space. And then he saw it, the message on the wall, written in red. "Come find me. I'm in your closet." Brian's heart skipped a beat. He had seen the writing before, but something about it felt different this time. It was as if the words themselves were alive, taunting him, daring him to investigate further. He swallowed hard and approached the wall, running his fingers over the letters. The paint was still wet. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure, a man, dressed in his deceased wife's clothes, wearing a wig and holding a hatchet. The sight of the intruder sent a wave of shock through Brian. He was frozen in place, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The man's eyes were wild, his face twisted into a manic grin. He raised the hatchet, ready to strike, but Brian reacted instinctively, lunging forward and grappling with the intruder. The two men struggled, the sound of their scuffle echoing through the basement. But the intruder, despite his disheveled appearance, was strong and agile. He managed to break free from Brian's grasp and bolted up the stairs, disappearing into the darkness of the house. Brian, breathing heavily, stood in the middle of the basement, his heart racing. The man had been real. He had seen him, fought him. But now he was gone, vanished into the shadows of the house. Brian knew he had to get out, to get his daughters to safety. He ran out of the house and back to the neighbors, where he called the police.
911, what's your emergency?
When they arrived, the house was thoroughly searched, but no trace of the intruder was found. The police were baffled, but they believed Brian's account of the man in the dress. They advised the family to stay elsewhere until they could determine what was going on. Brian, shaken to his core, took his daughters to stay with relatives for the next 2 weeks. During that time, the house was monitored by the police, but there were no further incidents. However, the fear and trauma of what had happened weighed heavily on the family. After 2 weeks, the Andrews family decided to return home. Living with relatives had been difficult, and they were eager to return to some semblance of normalcy. Brian had convinced himself that the intruder had fled, that the police presence had scared him off. But as they drove up to their house, a sense of unease settled over them. Brian noticed that a light was on in the house, coming from one of the upstairs bedrooms. He frowned, thinking that perhaps the police had left it on by mistake. But as he looked closer, he saw a figure moving in the window. A man, dressed in his wife's clothes, walking across the room. Brian's heart raced as he realized that the intruder was still in the house. He quickly called the police, who arrived within minutes, surrounding the house and preparing to enter. The family stayed outside, watching anxiously as the officers moved in. The police entered the Andrews' home with a sense of grim determination. They had heard the disturbing details from Brian and his daughters, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to encounter. As they stepped inside, the house felt like a trap, heavy with a palpable sense of fear that had settled into the very walls. The officers moved cautiously, their flashlights slicing through the thick darkness, illuminating the eerie silence that enveloped the home. As they entered the living room, their beams revealed a scene of disarray. The once orderly room was now in complete chaos. The couch was overturned, its cushions scattered across the floor, as though someone had searched frantically for something. A coffee table lay on its side, one leg splintered, as if kicked over in a violent struggle. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. This was no ordinary break-in. The officers moved deeper into the house, where their lights revealed more disturbing details. In the dining room, chairs were toppled, some lying on their sides, others haphazardly leaning against the walls. The table was bare, the tablecloth ripped away, leaving only a few scattered utensils to hint at the normalcy that had once existed here. But what caught their attention most was the ceiling above. There, glued meticulously to it, were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of pennies. Their copper surfaces gleamed dully in the flashlight beams, creating an eerie, otherworldly effect. The officers paused, unnerved by the bizarre sight. Why would anyone do this? It was unsettling in its randomness, a hint of the disturbed mind that had been at work here. But the pennies were not the most disturbing discovery. As the officers continued their search, they noticed something far more chilling. Cryptic messages scrawled in red on the walls. The writing was crude, erratic, but undeniably intentional. The messages, though brief, carried a weight of menace. "I'm in your room, come and find me." And another that read, "I'm in your closet." Despite the state of the house, there was no immediate sign of the intruder. The officers methodically cleared each room, their flashlights sweeping over every surface, but the house remained unnervingly silent. Each empty room only heightened the sense of dread. Where could the man responsible for this madness be hiding? Finally, the officers made their way to the basement. The air grew colder as they descended the narrow staircase, the faint smell of mildew filling their noses. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, dusty boxes, and forgotten items, casting long shadows in the flashlight beams. One officer, scanning the room, noticed something unusual behind the washer and dryer. A small, almost imperceptible gap. It was a piece of wood, slightly ajar, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The officer approached cautiously, shining his flashlight into the gap. His heart pounded as he realized what it was: a hidden crawl space. With a steady hand, he carefully moved the appliances aside and pulled back the piece of wood, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel. The beam of the flashlight penetrated the darkness, revealing the cramped space beyond. The walls were lined with insulation, and the tunnel stretched deeper into the house, winding through the structure like a hidden artery. As the officer's light swept across the crawl space, he froze. There, crouched in the narrow space, was a figure. There, wedged into the tiny space, was Daniel LaPlante. His eyes, wild with fear or madness, or perhaps both, reflected the light back at the officer. He was a sight to behold. Filthy, unkempt, his hair matted, and his clothes tattered. He looked more like a creature than a human being, twisted and contorted to fit into the tight space he had made his home for months. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The officer and LaPlante locked eyes, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Then, with a burst of adrenaline, the officer shouted for backup, and within seconds, the crawl space was flooded with light and the sounds of officers rushing in. LaPlante was dragged out of the crawl space, his resistance weak but frantic. The officers quickly restrained him, cuffing his hands behind his back. As they led him out of the basement, the full horror of the situation became evident. LaPlante had been living in the walls of the Andrews home for weeks, maybe even months, spying on the family through peepholes he had carved into the walls, listening to their every conversation, and terrorizing them with the tapping sounds and ominous messages. What made the discovery even more disturbing was LaPlante's history with the family. He had briefly dated Annie Andrews, one of the daughters, but the relationship had ended quickly when Annie felt uncomfortable with his strange behavior. LaPlante had been infatuated with her, and when the relationship ended, he became obsessed, sneaking into their home and hiding in the walls. From his hidden vantage points, he had watched their every move, learning their routines, and using this knowledge to torment them. LaPlante was taken into custody and eventually convicted of multiple charges, including the terrifying ordeal he had put the Andrews family through. But his story didn't end there. After being released from juvenile detention later that year, LaPlante would go on to commit even more heinous crimes, including the brutal murder of a pregnant woman and her 2 children, a crime that shocked the community and sealed his fate as one of the most disturbed individuals the town had ever known. The story of the Andrews family is a chilling reminder of how quickly life can turn from ordinary to nightmarish. They were a family already struggling with the profound loss of a loved one, trying to find their way through the shadows of grief. But instead of healing, they were plunged into a living nightmare, their pain and vulnerability exploited by the twisted actions of a disturbed individual who brought terror into their home. In an instant, their sanctuary was transformed into a place of fear, where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred. The walls that once held memories of love and laughter became a prison of anxiety and dread. This story serves as a haunting example of how the darkest horrors often come not from distant, imagined threats, but from the very places we believe to be the safest. If you found this story chilling, be sure to subscribe to Slumber Darkly, where we bring you true dark stories designed to both unsettle and soothe, offering a place to confront these fears together. Here, the shadows that creep into our lives can be faced, and perhaps even understood, in the safety of shared experience. Thank you for joining me tonight, and as always, may your sleep be peaceful and undisturbed.